Welcome to A Year in the Bible with Daily Grace. From Eden to eternity, the Bible tells one big story of redemption. My name is Tiffany, and I want to spend a few minutes with you every day walking through the Bible chronologically. Together, we will explore God's sovereign plan as the events of Scripture unfold and point to Jesus. Hey friends, Tiffany here. And it is such an exciting day on the podcast as we complete another book in our chronological journey. As we walk through this year, it's important to take time to celebrate God's faithfulness across history and also in our own lives as He helps us draw near to Him in the Word. Even in just a few short months, we've seen God's faithfulness time and time again. As we read the final 3 chapters of Joshua today, we will see His faithfulness once again. Chapter 22 is a beautiful picture of obedience and vow fulfillment. Even though the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and half of Manasseh had received their land inheritance east of the Jordan River before Moses' death, they swore to Moses that they would fight with their brothers to take possession of the Promised Land. After a conquest that was likely 5 to 7 years long, Joshua now says their vow is fulfilled. He exhorts them to remain obedient as they return to their land. They are to love and serve the Lord with their heart and soul. They are also given the reward of taking as much plunder and spoil with them as they can carry. The men from these tribes did as they were asked, and now they too could find rest in their land. As these tribes crossed the Jordan River to return home, they built a large altar. This brought an immediate response from the 9.5 other tribes, a response of war. The western tribes believed that the eastern tribes were trying to replace the tabernacle with their own place of worship. And while this was a misunderstanding between the tribes, the response of the western tribes is commendable. Their swift response to purge this perceived evil from the land displays obedient hearts that sought to be holy as God called them to be. The response from the 2.5 eastern tribes is also encouraging, as they first appeal to God who knows their hearts and understood their intentions. Then they appeal to their brothers from the western tribes. Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh built this altar to serve as a witness to the generations to come that their 2.5 tribes worshipped and served and feared the same God as the western tribes. It was a witness to their unity as a nation despite their land boundaries. Never once was the altar meant to be used for sacrifices. It was simply a memorial. And if you've been keeping count, it is the 6th memorial of 7 here in the book of Joshua. It was a memorial between these tribes that the Lord is God. This event in Joshua 22 teaches us a couple of things. First, we see that the current generation does indeed desire to serve the Lord and walk in obedience. Even though the tribes on either side of the Jordan River misunderstood each other, God knew their hearts, and He brought reconciliation and unity between them. Second, we see subtle change in leadership. Notice that neither Joshua nor Eleazar, the high priest, handled this situation. It was Eleazar's son, Phinehas, who led the western tribes to meet with the eastern ones. As Joshua and Eleazar's time draws to a close on the earth, Phinehas now takes on the prominent spiritual role in the nation. As we transition to chapter 23, we read that Joshua addresses the nation a long time later. Many scholars believe that around 25 years have passed since God gave them rest in the land. This is based on the fact that we think Joshua and Caleb were likely around the same age, and Scripture tells us Caleb was 85 when he received his inheritance, and later we will read that Joshua was 110 when he died. Joshua knew his time was short, and he addressed the nation one last time. Joshua reminds the people of the truths of the statutes and commands that had been shared with them from the time they were given to Moses until that day. He summarizes by reminding them that they are to be strong and continue in obedience. They must not worship the idols of the nations around them, but be loyal to the Lord. In Joshua 23:14, Joshua says, "You know with all your heart and all your soul that none of the good promises the Lord your God made to you has failed. Everything was fulfilled for you. Not one promise has failed." God has always been faithful, and we can trust He always will be. God's plan of redemption declares His faithfulness across the generations. Every fulfilled promise, woven together across history, creates a beautiful tapestry that finds completion in Jesus Christ. When Jesus cried, "It is finished," on the cross, no good promise from the Lord failed. When He rose from the grave, everything was fulfilled to draw us back into a right relationship with the Lord. And when Jesus comes again, His victory over this world and the ushering in of a new one will cry that no promise has failed. These truths should bring our hearts to worship, but they should also stir our hearts to obedience. Though Joshua and the Israelites saw the Messiah dimly, God fulfilled promises and certainty of future fulfilled promises were to drive them to obedience as well. In chapter 24, Joshua assembles the people at Shechem, and the structure of his final speech should remind us of something we've already studied culturally. If you think back to Deuteronomy, we learned how Moses' speeches were like the suzerain vassal treaties of this era. Joshua 24 is the same structure. We read a preamble, followed by the historical recounting of the nation from Abraham to the conquering of Canaan. Joshua then provides the stipulations for the nation's obedience to God's statutes and ordinances. It is in this section we read one of the most famous verses in the book of Joshua. Joshua declares to the nation in 24:15, "As for me and my family, we will serve the Lord." The nation declares their agreement to follow the Lord in the same way, and they become witnesses to themselves that they would worship the Lord alone. Their blessings for obedience and curses for disobedience are sprinkled throughout the passage. After the nation agrees, Joshua erects the seventh and final memorial. This memorial was called Witness, to remind the people to serve the Lord because He is faithful. The final 5 verses of Joshua end the patriarchal and conquest periods of Israel's history. They are marked by the burial of 3 men, Joshua, Joseph, and Eleazar. Joseph's bones had been carried out of Egypt, across the wilderness, and through the conquest of Canaan. He now rested in Shechem. Joshua and Eleazar served as faithful leaders over Israel, and their obedience to the Lord was an example to their generation and the next. God had indeed brought partial fulfillment to His promises to Abraham from so long ago. Israel was a great nation. They were blessed by God in His presence, and they now had a land to call their own. And though these fulfillments were a gift, God's greatest work was still to come. I'm so glad you joined me today as we celebrated the end of Joshua. Tomorrow, we begin the book of Judges. I will see you then, friends. Bye.